In this week's lectures, we're going to look at the role and importance of St. Maximus, the Confessor, the role that he played in developing the Chalcedonian diothelite Christology, the Christology that affirmed not just two natures, but also two energies, divine and human, and two wills. We'll take a look also at Maximus, as well as his Palestinian supporters' role in the convening and acts of Lateran 649 that was convened after having been organized and planned by Pope Theodore, who died in 649, and then Lateran, however, was actually convened and carried out during the pontificate and under the presidency of Pope Martin I. So this week's lectures, the main theme is Maximus and Lateran 649, the Monothelite controversy, as well as its theological implications with respect especially to the development in theological metaphysics concerning the person of Christ, but also the implications, as we'll see in next week's lectures, for later developments in theology proper, the distinction between the uncreated essence and energies of God, and how that came to play in the theology and came to be worked out in the theology of St. Gregory Palamas. We find the roots of this distinction already in Lateran 649, and again, as we'll see next week, Constantinople III, coming out of this controversy with the Monothelites and the monoenergists. This week's three lectures will come in basically three stages. This lecture will deal with the broader historical context having to do with military and ecclesiastical conflicts and divisions that the imperium found itself dealing with during the decade of 640 to 649. And then the next lecture, the second lecture, will look specifically at St. Maximus the Confessor, his writings with respect to the Monothelite controversy beginning in the 630s, at least by implication, and then becoming explicit and clear throughout the decade of the 640s. And then finally, the third lecture will deal with the council or the Lateran Synod, 649 Synod itself, looking at its contexts, arguing that St. Maximus the Confessor was the main player, the main author of the Acta, and Lateran 649 can be seen essentially as St. Maximus's synod or council. So first to the historical background. In this lecture, we'll look at, again, reviewing some of the material we discussed in the previous lecture, but then moving specifically into an evaluation of the perspective of the three main patriarchal players in this controversy in the 640s, namely the Patriarchate of Constantinople, the unoccupied, but nevertheless extremely important Patriarchate of Jerusalem through its representatives at Rome in the figure of St. Maximus and his fellow Palestinian monks, and the See of Rome, or the Patriarchate of Rome itself. By viewing these three patriarchates, we'll be able to further shed light on the different presuppositions and intentions of each patriarchate vis-a-vis itself and its role in the broader imperium and the church, as well as how each patriarchate understood the role of the emperor with respect to the functions of the church, both concerning the definition and development and defense of the Council of Chalcedon against heresy or lack of defense, as well as the importance of Christianity itself as a social movement, a social reality, a transformative social reality within the local environs throughout the territories of each patriarchate, and as really the primary factor in establishing and maintaining the unity of the empire itself, even beyond military and economic conquest and prosperity, respectively. So let's begin. So briefly reviewing historical context, remember that Heraclius was emperor from 610 to 641. He followed upon the tyrant Phocas, who did maintain good relationship with Rome throughout his period as emperor. However, he was considered a tyrant by many. Also, remember the figure of Sergius of Constantinople, coming to the See of Constantinople already appointed by Heraclius in Heraclius's first year of his reign in 610, and then only dying all the way in 638. Also a major player that we must remember, Honorius of Rome, and his notorious letter or letters, 2 letters to Sergius, wherein he confessed the monothelite position. Also Saint Sophronius of Jerusalem, important not only for his synodal letter wherein he questioned the orthodoxy of monothelitism and monoenergism, but also Sophronius is important for, as we will see in the subsequent lectures, for the Florilegia he did collect of the fathers that will be used along with the Florilegia of St. Maximus the Confessor himself, which will also appear in the Synod of 649 in session 5. And then finally, we can't forget that Sophronius was the exiled patriarch of Jerusalem, who was the primary intellectual mentor and spiritual mentor of St. Maximus himself, the main theological figure through this whole controversy. Remember also the Ekthesis, written by Sergius, but only published by Heraclius subsequent to Sergius's death, wherein the Ekthesis basically killed theological discussion in a quasi-Henoticon-esque imperial policy, as well as patriarchal policy of seeking doctrinal and thereby political unity through a kind of minimalist interpretation of Chalcedon, and thereby disallowing or forbidding any discussion of 1 or 2 wills, and the assertion of Christ having only 1 will, albeit ill-defined and perhaps misunderstood or poorly understood by many of those who made that assertion. Keep in mind also that during this entire period, or most of it, there was an ongoing war, the Second War with the Persian Sasanian Empire, which left both the Persian Empire as well as the Byzantine Empire exhausted, both spiritually, but also more importantly financially, which then paved the way, even though the Byzantine Empire came out on top, paved the way for the very quick incursion and conquering of vast territories of both the Persian and Byzantine empires, important land holdings, key land holdings, especially with respect to the Byzantine Empire in terms of its food and economic production and wealth. And so we have to remember that while the monoenergist, and by implication the monothelite debates are taking off, we have at the same time a protracted war going on between the Byzantine Empire, threatening the temporal security of the empire itself. And so there was great concern on the part of the emperors, Heraclius, and his successor, Constans II, who becomes a major figure in the 640s, to secure ecclesiastical unity, especially with those important sees in Palestine and Alexandria and Syria, as a breakwater against Muslim incursion and ultimately domination. Also keep in mind Cyrus of Alexandria, who initially was against the monothelite or monoenergist, position and mode of operating of Heraclius and Sergius. However, by 633, following Sergius's lead, he had published a document of union in Alexandria with the Miaphysites, wherein he was very successful in achieving unity as the appointed Chalcedonian Patriarch of Alexandria, with the continuing holdouts of Miaphysites. And so this union in its success with the Miaphysites becomes not only an intra-Chalcedonian dispute and discussion, but it becomes an inter-Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian discussion, and its very success prompted later on the publication of the Ekthesis, which we've already mentioned, forbade discussion of the one or two wills and discussion of energies, and asserted that Christ only had one will. And so these are some important factors to keep in mind. Imagine a situation of great tension and conflict all around, and many uncertainties lying at the door with respect to both the ecclesiastical as well as the political unity of the imperium and the most important sees in the imperium, specifically Constantinople, Alexandria, Rome, and Jerusalem. As I just mentioned, the war between the Persians and the Romans, the Eastern Romans, in fact exhausted the resources of both empires, and by 634 Muslim forces were already encroaching upon Byzantine territories. And in that same year, Muslims, or the Arabs, overran Gaza and began a conquest of the Levant, thereby in a certain way dividing in half, practically speaking, the Byzantine Empire from itself. They split the empire, perhaps not literally, but figuratively down the middle, and created a great deal of conflict. By 636, Syria too was conquered, and also one must keep in mind that Persia fell quite quickly. The Sasanian Empire fell to the Muslims very shortly after the end of the Byzantine-Persian War. By 636 or 637 or 38, Sophronius himself, in the face of Palestine's being conquered by the Arabs, turns over and, in a sense, goes into exile from his see in Jerusalem and comes to Rome. At the same time, or a couple of years later, Maximus, his disciple, begins his campaign against the Ekthesis assertion of one will. And so we find in the late 630s, then, as a result of exile and other reasons we'll mention a little bit later, Sophronius and Maximus are refugees, along with a significant contingent of Chalcedonian Palestinian monks in Rome, seeking papal support and the Pope's patriarchal voice with respect to the imperial de facto suppression or de jure suppression of discussion of the diothelite versus monothelite question, and the de facto loss of patriarchal voice in this discussion or dispute between Constantinople and Sophronius and Maximus and the Palestinians, because of the occupation now of Jerusalem and the Patriarchate, the territories of the Patriarchate of Jerusalem by the Arab Muslims. By 638, as I've already mentioned, Sophronius had died, and Maximus and Sophronius were both in Rome seeking papal support. And in 641, Constans II comes to the throne at the age of only 17. And so if you can imagine the mess that the empire is in and the imperial church is in with respect to this controversy, Constans is wanting to preserve peace in the church in order to foster unity in the empire. But immediately upon his accession to the throne, the imperial throne, his uncle tries to get him assassinated. And so there's treachery from within the Byzantine court. There is the imminent and continual threat of the Muslim invasion, having already taken over serious and important territories. And there is the issue of continued religious division in Alexandria and in Syria, and now arising between Constantinople and Palestine. And as we will see in 640, Rome itself. And so we find that Constans is in a very difficult situation, especially for a ruler so young. What we have to mention also is that early on, Constans seemingly wanted to come to an agreement, a peaceable agreement with the Bishop of Rome in the person of John IV, and there's a supposed letter that gets referred to later on by Pope Theodore, in the later 640s, wherein Constans is reported to have offered his agreement to withdraw the ekphasis. But as we will find, this withdrawing is not forthcoming and creates consternation and an eventual about-face on the part of Paul of Alexandria, the successor to Pyrrhus of Alexandria, who earlier was deposed by the Bishop of Rome for his adherence to the ekphasis. And in 645, we find Paul writing an explosive letter to Theodore, renouncing any kind of withdrawing of the ekphasis and doubling down on the ekphasis, which then results in Constans's typos, which extends and intensifies the contents of the ekphasis. And so now we turn to the more specific context, and we'll look first at, excuse me, I jumped the gun a bit. I've already touched upon this. In 641, Pyrrhus was deposed by John IV. This deposition was irregularly or not accepted in Constantinople, but Pyrrhus himself fled and withdrew from the see of Constantinople, and Paul was then elected to take his place. In 642, Theodore was elected, and this is an interesting fact that we'll touch upon and develop a bit further, but we find Theodore elected. He was Greek, but likely a member of the Roman clergy, not a monastic, who was reportedly the son of the Bishop of Jerusalem. Now, this is interesting because of the situation arising between Rome and Constantinople and the influence of Palestinian monks, especially St. Maximus, with respect to the specifically Greek controversy of monoenergism and monothelitism. And so Theodore is put in place with having close ties to the Patriarchate of Jerusalem, being the son of the Bishop of Jerusalem, a former Bishop of Jerusalem, and having essentially a Greek theological formation and background. And as one can imagine, the election of Theodore took place with these considerations in mind, and immediately served to forge closer ties with the Palestinian monks, thereby creating a strong theological current that ran contrary to the theological approach of the emperor and Paul of Constantinople. After a few years of badgering and demands coming from Theodore, Paul of Alexandria, as we've already mentioned, Pyrrhus's successor, writes a letter to Pope Theodore wherein he says, basically, you're rude, you're acting in an insufferable manner, you're overextending your authority, and I'm not going to renounce the ekthesis, even if Constans himself said he would do this. We're no longer going to do this. We're in fact going to uphold the ekthesis, and we're going to further pursue the policy of the ekthesis. In 645 and 646, bishops of Byzantine and other areas of North Africa, loyal to the Palestinian Roman approach, the anti-modernist approach, anti-monoenergist approach, and anti-monothelite approach, meet in separate local councils wherein monothelitism is explicitly condemned. And in the political front, about the same time, Exarch Gregory in North Africa enters into open rebellion against Constans. And this is interesting because we will see that Maximus himself is brought up in the sense of having colluded with Gregory in his rebellion against Constans, as well as Gregory himself is said to have overseen the famous disputation between St. Maximus and Pyrrhus in North Africa in around the year 645. So there's a close connection now between Rome and the Palestinians through Maximus, when already North Africa is already antipathetic or critical of monothelitism. There now is a further connection in the political sphere between Palestine, Rome, and rebellion or subverting of the imperial order under Constans. So following Pope Paul of Alexandria's letter to Pope Theodore, Constans in 647 or 648 published his typos, or typos, and in this document, which was made law for the entire imperium, all talk of the number or distinction or the reality as such of wills and energies in Christ was simply banned. This was imperial policy now not to talk of wills or energies. And what we find then is under Theodore, papal dissent from Constans hardens because of the ekthos, the ekthesis, the typos, the failure to condemn Pyrrhus, which Theodore demanded a council be convened in Constantinople to formally condemn Pyrrhus and his followers, having appointed his own apocrysarii to oversee the condemnation of Pyrrhus. Theodore is quite fed up with the temporizing or inaction on the part of the emperor, and so this is one aspect of why Theodore decides to go it alone and to oppose the imperial policy, and by implication the strategy for unity for doctrinal law throughout the imperium. And then also Theodore then himself convened a council to condemn Pyrrhus. He personally deposed Paul, both without and even against the will of the emperor. And to take a step further, he invested a disciple of Sophronius, a certain Stephen of Dora, in the context of the vacant see of Jerusalem, to investigate non-Chalcedonian bishops in Jerusalem and to either depose them or regularize such bishops canonically. And what we mean by non-Chalcedonian essentially are Miaphysites. So now we turn to the perspective from Constantinople. Well, clearly Heraclius and then later on Constans II are worried in order about the Persians and the Arabs, and throughout this entire time, they're worried about the disunity amongst the Christians themselves, which serves to undermine the cohesiveness and unity of the empire. It should be noted from the Constantinopolitan question and from the historical topoi, or places in which the issue actually arose, that the one energy will versus two energies and two wills was initially an intra-Chalcedonian question. It's only in 633, with its success, the monoenergist approach's success in Alexandria with Miaphysites, that the one energy will versus two energies wills became a broader imperium issue and, in a sense, ecumenical issue with respect to Chalcedonians and non-Chalcedonians. However, in fact, and this is something that Sophronius recognizes early on, the monoenergist position, and by extension the monothelite position, had clear affinities with Severus of Antioch. As you remember, Severus allowed for only speaking of Christ in terms of one energy, which is in a certain way a development of his Miaphysite Christology. Another issue that is relevant and important, although perhaps not as easily appreciated from our more modern scientific or so-called scientific perspective, is the role of God's providence in the course of history, the success and prosperity of nations. And so common to the Palestinian worldview, the Palestinian patriarchal worldview, the worldview of the emperor and Sergius and Paul of Alexandria, as well as of the Roman popes, is that success is a manifestation of God's favor, a manifestation of God's approval in a course of action. So because of the monoenergist position and posture of the imperial church during this time in Alexandria, as well as the success in 628 of the empire in defeating the Persians, Heraclius and later Constans thought that this indicated God's favor with respect to seeking ecclesiastical unity through the ekthesis program. And one also must keep in mind that in 630, when Constantinople had temporarily reconquered Jerusalem, there was the restoration of the true cross at Golgotha, and Heraclius is proclaimed a new David and a new Constantine, another sign of God's favor through military success, culminating in the outworking of quasi-sacramental or quasi-sacramental success in the recovery and replacement of the true cross in Jerusalem, a sign of God's favor. And then finally, at least with respect to this slide, the issue over one will or energy even from a Chalcedonian perspective, at least in terms of explicit outworking and explanation, was still a relatively open issue. One can clearly state and clearly recognize that Sophronius and Maximus and Martin were logically and metaphysically on the right side of Chalcedon. However, there had been no formal decision with respect to the implications of one person in two natures, wherein the forms or energies or operations of those two natures truly functioned. So I think one can clearly understand that when one asserts one person in two natures, and each nature operates according to its, or each form operates according to its intrinsic powers of operation, this very clearly and through quite simple inference would indicate multiple energies and multiple wills, namely two energies, divine and human, and two wills in Christ. However, in terms of explicit formulation and clarification at the outset of the debate, this question had not ultimately been settled. So from Sergius's perspective, and even in one sense, Honorius of Rome's perspective, as well as Heraclius's and Constance's perspective, they didn't feel they were going against or beyond or outside of the pale of Chalcedonian orthodoxy, even though by logical implication of the definition of Chalcedon as well as Leo's tome, they were moving contrary to it. But that initially, at least, wasn't their intention, nor was it their understanding with respect to their own position, affirming monoenergism and asserting one will in Christ. So as we've already mentioned, it's important to keep in mind that the 633 Sephos of Cyrus of Alexandria did in fact affect ecclesial unity, while at the same time, and it moreover affected ecclesiastical unity in the very important North African Sea of Alexandria, a key locus for economic and food supply of the empire, while at the same time the invasions of the Arabs, the Muslim Arabs, began in earnest. So a great concern for Heraclius and Constance is to preserve ecclesiastical unity, while at the same time, by implication or through the preservation of ecclesiastical unity through a doctrinal compromise, perhaps minimalistic approach to the question and reception and enforcement of Chalcedon, would affect political and territorial unity. So here we find a clear politico-ecclesial entanglement, which in some sense was absolutely inevitable, and even if inevitable, not entirely negative. However, with respect to the suppression of true theological discussion and the assertion of one energy, one will, clearly ecclesiastical unity was hanging by a thread with respect to this issue, simply because it was an erroneous formulation and reception and application of Chalcedon. Also, we have to keep in mind that, between 634 635, we find the letters of Sergius, Honorius, and Sophronius. We've already gone over this, so I don't need to rehearse this, but you find the debate opening up now in earnest. On the one hand, Sergius and Honorius of Constantinople and Rome, respectively, affirming one will and expressing their surprise with the diathelite Sophronius, that it's even an issue. Sophronius is coming up with novel terms and novel arguments and topics worthy of wordsmiths and sophists, which in fact Sophronius formerly was. on the one hand, so we find growing confusion and on the parts of both the bishops of Constantinople and Rome, and really Sophronius and his school, his disciples, clearly articulating the true Chalcedonian position vis-a-vis the energies and wills of Christ. And at the same time, we have to remember that Rome and the clergy of Rome and the environs in the Roman Patriarchate, a lot of the churches within the Patriarchate, still have concern and resentment with respect to Constantinople because, and this is something I did not mention, in the wake of Constantinople II, a schism in the Roman Patriarchate occurred, and that schism still was continuing during the rise of the monoenergist and monothelite controversy. The northern Italian Lombard or Lombardian holdings in Italy were still out of communion with Rome in de facto schism over the three chapters, and many bishops and churches in North Africa still suspected that Rome had capitulated in Constantinople by the condemnation of the three chapters, and in essence, or in implication, had rejected Constantinople II. Chalcedon 451 in terms of Chalcedon's acceptance of the orthodoxy of Theodore and Ebus. So Rome is dealing with its own problems at the same time, and Rome is very hesitant to go along with any, except in the person of Honorius. But Honorius, again, is trying to preserve peace, as is Sergius and Heraclius at this point. But the Rome and the churches within its patriarchate are very hesitant to do anything, to kind of make the situation worse, and B, to imply any kind of repudiation or turning back from Chalcedon and its definition. When the ekthesis hits in 638, remember, the ekthesis was written by Sergius but promulgated by Heraclius. We find very stark and hard political and ecclesiastical divides beginning to take place. On the one hand, there's the Roman and the Roman Palestinian faction, and on the other hand, you have Constantinople and the empire. And the division through the 640s increases and hardens to the point of, in the wake of Lateran Synod, immediately after the Lateran Synod, although the order can only be effected in 652, Pope Martin was arrested and transported to Constantinople and ended up dying basically a martyr's death, as well as Maximus himself was finally arrested, very likely at the same time, but only arrives in Constantinople to undergo his first trial in 655. So the strong division between Rome and Palestine, however, begins with the ekthesis, wherein you find already dislocated Greek or Greco-Palestinian monks from Jerusalem and the surrounding areas coming to Rome in order to plead their diothelite case, their anti-ekthesis position with the Pope of Rome. And of course, the Pope of Rome is interested in preserving unity and ending schism in its own backyard with the Lombards and keeping the North Africans happy as well. So in the 640s, then, if you have a kind of stance of appeasement in the person of Honorius, you find a radical turn from this policy upon the death of Honorius and the election of Severinus and John IV. Severinus and John IV are both interesting because both of them refuse to sign and are very condemnatory of the ekthesis, both doctrinally as well as in terms of policy for church unity. However, both Severinus and John IV, Severinus only ruling as pope or reigning as pope or occupying the chair of Peter for just 1 year, even one part of a year, and that's followed immediately by John IV, we find nevertheless that unity between Constantinople and Rome was the Imperium and Rome, the Empire and Rome, was not broken, because both Severinus and John IV, as was custom and required at the time, their consecration as Bishop of Rome and the election to the papacy was approved by the reigning emperor. And so even though they're radically opposed now to the ekthesis, nevertheless, there still is a working relationship between Rome and Constantinople, and there's a mutual recognition. Then from Constantinople, the perspective throughout the 640s, and we'll discuss this further when we look at Palestine and Rome, the situation only worsened. The adherence to the ekthesis hardened and became explicit in the figure of Paul of Alexandria, or excuse me, Paul of Constantinople. And in 648, we find Constans II publishing or promulgating his typos. And in some ways, we can look at this as a Henoticon type attempt, maybe perhaps even desperate, to maintain doctrinal unity within the Imperium, including Rome, as an essential component of the Imperium and the Imperial Church, in the face of looming and increasing territorial chaos and the division amongst Christians, and thus, by implication, territorial divisions between them that would affect and undermine the unity of the empire. And another one point that should be noted as well is upon the conquering of especially the non-Chalcedonian churches on the part of the Arab Muslims, there was a relative indifference to their particular heresies or theological errors. Muslims were happy so long as the Christians suited their vision of society to allow them to maintain and develop their own now schismatic ecclesiastical bodies. And so this is an important and perhaps desperate attempt on the part, or at least in the mind of Paul and Constans, to preserve doctrinal unity, because apart from doctrinal unity, on account of the close entanglement between political and ecclesiastical, temporal and spiritual realms within the one imperium, there would inevitably be a breakdown of the imperium itself. The imperium itself would be undermined. Now turning to Palestine, we'll look at the Palestinian perspective. Remember that the Patriarchate of Jerusalem was one of the key patriarchates in the Imperium, the Imperial Church. And when in 636 or thereabout, Jerusalem is again conquered, this time by Muslims. The Patriarch, the see itself is vacated by Sophronius. And so, in a sense, there was a loss of a patriarchal voice over against the perceived anti-Chalcedonian imperial monergistic or monoenergistic and monothelite policy and doctrine. So in the interest of gaining a patriarchal voice, in their defense and development of Chalcedon against monoenergism and monothelitism, as well as to preserve sacramental, Eucharistic purity and distinction between orthodox and heretical ecclesiastical bodies. The Palestinians under Sophronius, and then clearly and more pronouncedly under St. Maximus himself, sought the support of the papacy in order to gain a strong patriarchal voice, but also with a growing recognition, or at least an assertion, of the true functional primacy of the Bishop of Rome with respect to and within the imperial church, and with respect to the preservation, promulgation of orthodox theology, the preservation of the teachings of the councils, especially Chalcedon. Another thing to keep in mind is, and this perhaps is why Sophronius and later on Maximus, who was taught by Sophronius, were so concerned about the monoenergist and monothelite imperial ecclesiastical doctrinal policy. This is because already in the early 600s, in the years likely between 602 and 610, Sophronius, with his good friend and mentor John Muscus, fled Palestine in the wake of Persian incursion and went to Alexandria, wherein they became quite familiar through debate and study with the Miaphysite position. Some scholars also speculate at this time that Sophronius encountered Aristotle, and Aristotle's teaching that any nature must have a corresponding operation or energy in order for that nature to exist. So all natures have operations or energies, and it's through the operations or energies that the nature really exists. Otherwise, it's a pure abstraction. So with any nature, there must be a corresponding energy. And this, of course, along with his debating of the Monophysites and his understanding of the Severan position of monoenergism, which implies monothelitism, coupled with his understanding of Aristotle on nature and energies, he saw through, from a theological perspective, quite clearly the heretical import of the ekthesis and the monoenergist position of the imperial church. A couple decades later, and this is interesting in terms of the developments that become much more apparent in the 640s. We already have Maximus himself writing in a letter questioning the emperor's place in doctrinal matters. So Maximus, in a sense, is challenging the emperor in terms of having a specific and particular role in teaching and defining doctrine, as opposed to promulgating it and protecting it in the temporal sphere. So here we find already the division that Gelasius is speaking of with respect to the two swords. Where Gelasius speaks of the two swords, he speaks of the spiritual sword and the temporal sword, and they're to be in unity and while maintaining their distinction. And Maximus is saying that, following, at least by implication, Gelasius all the way back in the late 5th century, going into the early 6th century, Gelasius's assertion that, or challenging of temporal rulers, their place in interfering with the teaching of the church, in a sense arrogating to themselves a teaching function rather than a learning role or position vis-a-vis the bishops and the promulgation and defining of doctrine. We've already mentioned this before, but it's important to remember too that during the 630s, it becomes clear in Sophronius's writings that he wants a clear sacramental distinction and separation between Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian churches, and coupled with his deeper understanding of the Miaphysite position and the implications through his reception and application of Aristotle with respect to nature and energies, how in order to, if you have one, you must have the other, or you have neither. He sees that the imperial policy of maintaining unity or reestablishing unity is insufficient because clearly there should not be sacramental communion between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Christians. And for Sophronius, the Miaphysites were clearly non-Orthodox. In 634, then, Sophronius is elected, as we've already mentioned, to the patriarchal throne of Jerusalem. And within this, he brings to this see his knowledge of the Miaphysites, Miaphysite theology, his commitment to Chalcedon and sacramental separation between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Christians, as well as his understanding of the necessity for there being, on account of Christ's two natures, a corresponding two energies that manifest and, in a sense, render really or actually existent those two natures. So Sophronius, from the beginning, is quite opposed, both in praxis and in theological commitment and philosophical commitment to, or he's opposed to the method of unity that seeks to establish ecclesiastical unity through the assertion of one will, or even the acceptance of one will in Christ and one energy in Christ. For Sophronius, neither suppression of discussion nor implicit acceptance nor positive assertion of one energy and one will is sufficient. For Sophronius, the very reality of the unity of the church is in question because you have the reality of heresy and orthodoxy divided in terms of commitment to two energies and two wills. So if Heraclius and Constans saw the success of 633 in Alexandria with the Miaphysites through Cyrus's Sephos, and the victory over the Persians as signs of God's favor with respect to the imperial doctrinal policy of monoenergism and suppression of theological discussion of this point, the Palestinians, beginning with Sophronius and carried through with Maximus, interpreted the Arab success in Palestine and abroad, but especially in Palestine, as the emperor, as an indication of the emperor's and thereby the empire's loss of divine favor. And as the crisis worsened in the empire, especially militarily and politically, Sophronius's disillusionment also increased. There was a direct correlation. And he became more and more convinced that the favor of God had left the emperor and the empire, and also by implication the See of Constantinople, precisely because of their heterodoxy. By 636, however, as we've already mentioned, with the victory of the Arabs in Jerusalem, their conquering of Jerusalem, there was a de facto loss of the Jerusalem Patriarchate. In effect, Jerusalem as a patriarchate had no voice. And so in absence or in lieu of this patriarchal position from which to defend their diatholite theology, they sought another patriarchal voice that would in concert allow them to express and defend their diatholite theology. That's why they appeal to Rome. And clearly by 642, as I've already mentioned, the election of Theodore, who himself was Greco-Palestinian is no accident with respect to both the doctrinal and imperial political aspects of this situation. After Sophronius' death in the 640s, Rome's opposition to monoenergism and the ekthesis further justify the Palestinian attachment to Rome against Constantinople, and as well bolster their opposition to the imperial program of suppression of all discussion, as well as the empires and the emperors and the Patriarch of Constantinople's de facto affirmation of monoenergism and monothelitism. Because Sophronius with Maximus had already fled to Rome, they were able to apply shortly after the death of Honorius, and we'll see this in the figures, or we do see this in the figures already of Severinus and Pope John IV. They are able to put great pressure on the popes with respect to the defense of Chalcedon and Leo, both with an eye towards ending schism within the Patriarchate of Rome itself, as well as over and against the imperial policy and the policy of the Patriarch of Constantinople. So during this time period, there is a very profound Greek-Palestinian coloration and emphasis coming through papal policy and position with respect to Constantinople, the emperor, and the monoenergist and monothelite position. Also, Maximus himself, while early on in his writings in the 620s, 630s, we don't find explicit and specific attention given to the two wills doctrine. However, we do find in his writings to Thalassium, the questions he answers of Thalassius, as well as in his exposition of the Lord's Prayer, the seeds of his later theology, which will clearly affirm two wills in Christ. And so for Maximus, following the Sophronian strong line of defending Chalcedon and extending the implications of Chalcedon into every area of Christology, as well as Maximus's at least indirect knowledge of the kind of elision of the monoenergist position into a thoroughgoing Miaphysite position through Sophronius's direct knowledge of Alexandrian Christology gained during Sophronius's time in Alexandria. We already find that Maximus's later explicit theology, and we'll discuss this in greater detail in the following lecture, but nevertheless, even though it's not an explicit topic of concern in the early writings of Maximus, the seeds based upon his strong Chalcedonian perspective are already present in his early writings. So with the accession of Constans to the imperial throne, as well as the election of John IV and Theodore, by 641, the Palestinians' fate were now tied directly to the success and independence of the See of Rome. Palestinians now exiled in North Africa and Rome looked to Rome as their patriarchal voice over against the monoenergist and monothelite position. And by 645, Maximus, in the meantime, did go to North Africa because obviously he disputed with Pyrrhus in North Africa. However, by 645, he returned to Rome along with Pyrrhus to Rome and takes up permanent residence in Rome, and thus is able to help guide and direct the anti-monothelite, anti-monoenergist cause from Rome. During this time period, Maximus, in his writings in the 640s, basically provides three criteria for Roman primacy. And we find ever and greater emphasis on Roman primacy. It should be noted at the outset that the primacy that Maximus argued for was rooted in the continued and presumably continuing orthodoxy of the See of Rome, and it doesn't measure up to, say, Pastor Aeternus's or Pastor Aeterne's understanding and definition of papal infallibility and immediate episcopal jurisdiction on the part of the Bishop of Rome. However, he did argue for a true and juridical, a true primacy with teeth on the part of the Bishop of Rome, and basically he gives three criteria. One is the status of the Bishop of Rome, the recognized status of the Bishop of Rome as a guardian of orthodoxy. That's his first and most important criteria. At this point, Maximus also affirms the Bishop of Rome as having received the inheritance of Peter, rooting this understanding in, of course, the dominical words of our Lord found in Matthew 16:18, and then finally Rome's canonical recognition in councils as the primary see and the guardian of orthodoxy. Both canonical recognition and common acclaim. However, again, this doesn't yet measure up to later developments in terms of papal primacy or infallibility. Another important aspect is why you have Maximus supporting Roman primacy and arguing for Roman primacy, again, as this voice of a patriarch, or voice of the patriarch, in fact, the prime patriarch, over against the monoenergist policy of the imperial church, or at least part of the imperial church, in the person of the emperor and the patriarch of Constantinople. We find Maximus early on, already in the 630s, engaged in political activities that are suggestive of efforts to subvert the policies and desires of the emperors. In 633, Maximus, in I think it's his second trial, I may be mistaken there, allegedly advised Peter, who was at that time general of Numidia, to not support a policy of Heraclius. And sometime in the years following, or perhaps in 646, Maximus, of course, as we've already mentioned, had association with the North African exarch Gregory, who in fact leads a revolt against Constans in the North African territory. So Maximus was accused of being a political dissident within the empire and threatening to undermine the authority of the emperor through his engagements with Peter, erstwhile general of Numidia, as well as with the North African exarch Gregory. So it's not merely theological concerns that Maximus is dealing with and what he was put on trial for later. It was also his subversive political actions vis-a-vis the emperor that he was also put on trial for. Again, now getting back to the question of who was involved and the nature of the involvement, we find, again, the strong contingent of Greco-Palestinian monks, especially in the figure, and most notably in the figure of Maximus, bringing to the papal court and the Latin theological discussion a developed and highly advanced theological knowledge and vocabulary, whereby the See of Rome was able to argue against Greek theologians in favor of the Diothelite position. And at the same time, we have to remember the election in 642 of Pope Theodore himself, who was also Greco-Palestinian. And so, in a sense, Rome was ramping up for a theological debate with the Greek imperial monoenergists in the language and on the terms of the imperial monoenergists and monothelites themselves. We also see from and within the Palestinian perspective developing understanding and assertion of the importance and centrality and primacy of the See of Rome with respect to the maintaining and fostering of orthodoxy within the church in general, as well as a growing suspicion, as we've already mentioned, of temporal interference on the parts of especially the emperor concerning doctrinal discussions. And we can see that we've come quite a distance from the role of Justinian in just the previous century. And then finally, from the Palestinian perspective, and we'll look again at St. Maximus himself, as well as more in depth at the teachings coming out of Lateran 649. However, suffice it to say that this culminated for Maximus in Lateran 649, which Maximus himself in places asserts met all the criteria for an ecumenical council, although the acta themselves of 649 don't go this far. And this Lateran 649 was carried out and convened and carried out in defiance of the imperial will itself. In fact, Martin is consecrated Bishop of Rome without or apart from the recognition and approval of the Emperor Constans. So you have this movement of independence in defiance of the will of the Emperor. And of course, this laid certain seeds. They don't bear immediate fruit because the situation returns to the status quo a bit in the following decades when we come up to Constantinople III in 680, 681. However, they laid the groundwork for later church-state relations, which more and more asserted the independence of the church with respect to its own inner workings, as well as the primacy of the Roman bishop with respect to the church as a whole, as guardian of orthodoxy and the inheritor of the prerogatives, the unique prerogatives given to Peter in Matthew 16:18. So much for the Palestinians. Now we'll look at Rome. Key concerns or key outcomes of this period, this decade that culminates in Lateran 649, is a greater assertion of primacy and independence on the part of the Bishop of Rome with respect to the workings and the dictates of the emperor, and the emperor as guiding the imperial church. Also, another key factor, and we've touched upon this earlier, was the desire on Rome's part to prevent new schisms within its own patriarchate, as well as to heal the schism between the See of Rome and the sees in northern Italy. And then finally, Rome, with and through and along with the Greco-Palestinian theological impulse or impetus, was a strong and unqualified defense and development and articulation of Chalcedon itself. We need to understand, however, at this point, there were growing and developing very divergent understandings between East and West with respect to papal authority and jurisdiction. As beginning especially with, again, Pope Gelasius, in the I think his reign began in 492. We find stronger and stronger declarations or declamations of papal primacy with respect to the entire church, with respect to the imperium, and with respect to the other patriarchates. However, it's very clear that the Eastern churches didn't share these same assumptions, and so there was a great deal of disagreement and gray area with respect to just how the dictates of the papacy should be received or even would be received in the East. Clearly, the assumptions of the sees of Alexandria and Constantinople did not have the same appreciation of the claims to primacy on the part of the Bishop of Rome. And in fact, one could make a similar claim for the Patriarchate of Jerusalem, at least up until the time of Sophronius and the Palestinian monks appealing to Rome in favor of the diothelite, the dioenergetic understanding of Chalcedon over against the monoenergist and monothelite position on the part of the emperor and the patriarch of Constantinople. Another important factor that is increasing the prestige of Rome in the world is that during this period and during the decades before, Rome is becoming ever more an important destination for pilgrimage. Gregory I, in the beginning of the 7th century, remodeled St. Peter's in order to facilitate and to accommodate pilgrims. Honorius himself built a new church over the tomb of St. Agnes for the sake of the accommodation of pilgrimage. And John IV and Theodore translated many relics to Rome, thereby making Rome a much more desirable destination for pilgrimage. And, you know, in some sense, Rome had the trump card because it possessed the bones of St. Peter himself. And by this time, Rome was already functioning as a quasi-Western patriarch over Italy and parts of Africa and the increasingly evangelized European regions. We've already talked about the 3 chapters and the schism, as well as the rise of the monoenergist monothelite controversy. However, it's important to remember, even with this growing divergence and this growing sense of assertiveness on the parts of the Bishop of Rome, nevertheless, Rome remained closely tied with the empire, and in fact, one can say that between the years 590 and 752, there was a certain kind of symbiotic relationship between the empire, the imperial church, the emperor, and the Bishop of Rome. This symbiosis went 2 ways. The empire and the emperors wanted and understood the importance of Rome as a key component of the imperial church and the empire as such. And Rome, on the other hand, required the empire in terms of support, in both monetary and in terms of food supplies to carry out its own functions and jurisdiction in the far-flung regions, at least with respect to Rome at that time, of Gaul, Africa, Sardinia, parts of Italy, and Sicily. Rome was dependent upon the empire for supporting and upholding and carrying out its own ecclesiastical and humanitarian responsibilities in those regions. Rome also still needed, or at least accepted, the need of imperial approval for papal consecration. And during the same time period, these early decades up to Pope Martin himself, most of the popes, including Theodore and Martin, were nuncios to Constantinople. They spent their formative years as representatives of the court of the papal court in Constantinople. So we can see then throughout Gregory's pontificate and the subsequent papacies, there was still a fundamental union and an understanding of the propriety of that union between temporal and spiritual authorities. And we can find oblique reference to this in a certain letter we find in St. Bede the Venerable, a letter of Gregory himself to King Ethelbert of Kent, wherein Gregory asserts the spiritual priority and the teaching function of the bishop. However, Ethelbert is exhorted to seek for the destruction of idolatry and the conversion of his domains to Christianity as an aspect of the mission of the church in the temporal sphere, in order to, one, bring people to salvation, and two, to establish a good temporal order, a good social order. And these good relationships were in fact maintained all the way up into the pontificate of Severinus and John IV, when Severinus and John IV both renounced and condemned the ekthesis. So even though the seeds of opposition and division are being sown, and a deepening of what developed into a fully articulated, at least up to this point, understanding of papal primacy was present and at work, nevertheless, the interrelationship and symbiosis, the interrelated or the ordered interrelationship between temporal and spiritual authority in the one imperium was maintained and understood to be ordained by God himself for the good of society, for the good of the church. Um, 634, we've already mentioned this, Honorius and his famous correspondence with Sergius. Honorius, however, remained supportive of Sergius over against Sophronius and Maximus, even after the 636 condemnation at a local council of Cyprus of the positions of Sophronius and Maximus in favor of monoenergism. Then when we get to 640, and it took about 22 months for Severinus's consecration to be given the okay by Heraclius, we find in Severinus and John IV, who reigned collectively from 640 to 642, a radical about face on the issue of the ekthesis, probably as a result of concerns closer to home about ecclesiastical unity, concerns about keeping the North African bishops happy, and also the deepening understanding of the implications of the monoenergist, monothelite imperial doctrinal policy with respect to the Council of Chalcedon. And so you find from Severinus through John, through Theodore and Pope Martin, a radical changing of the relationship between Rome and the emperor and the Imperium, Rome and Constantinople, and a developing understanding of the primacy and relative independence of the Bishop of Rome vis-a-vis the emperor. It wasn't simply one-sided, however. There were shenanigans carried out in the name of the empire with respect to Rome, and there's record of at least 2 instances of interference, negative interference, on the part of the emperor in Rome during the reign of Severinus. The first one is recorded in the Liber Pontificalis, noting that a bureaucrat, a letter writer in Rome for the Pope, incited Roman soldiers to seize and raid the Lateran palace on the grounds that Severinus was hoarding gold and not sending the requisite stipends to Constantinople. And another one that apparently occurred sometime during the reign of Honorius or Severinus. It's at least after 638. The exarch, the imperial exarch, because remember, at Ravenna, Isaac And remember, Ravenna is still part of the empire proper. Isaac came to Rome and banished the clerics who might oppose him and raided the Lateran palace again, sending a portion of the proceeds of this raid to Heraclius. So one might suspect that resentment of recent memory, of incidents of recent memory, were also in the mind of the Bishop of Rome, as well as the Greco-Palestinian contingent, souring relations between Rome and Constantinople at this time. When we get to Pope John IV in 640-642, we find now John is demanding action, and these demands will only increase in the pontificate of Theodore. In the first place, John demands a formal condemnation of Pyrrhus, while at the same time he writes letters defending the orthodoxy of Honorius's letter. He also demands the condemnation of the ekthesis. And of course, remember that there is a reported letter that was written by Constans himself to John, promising the renunciation or withdrawal from the ekthesis as imperial doctrinal policy. However, John is not intent on severing relations at this point. And I think we don't find a clear intent to sever relations throughout this whole period, even if de facto this occurs and implications or conditions are laid out, whose implications are drawn out later on. John, at the same time or during the same period, also reminds Constans and compares him to his predecessor, Constantine. And of course, Gregory had already praised Constantine as a new David and a new Constantine. So in some sense, he's praising the role and affirming the role of the emperor, however, while at the same time making demands of the emperor as well as Archbishop Paul of Constantinople. And John himself assures the emperor, and here again is this common understanding of providence, assures the emperor with the rejection of the ekthesis, God would reward the emperor and the empire and preserve the unity and health of the imperium with military victory and peace with respect to especially the now conquering Arab Muslims. In 642, we find the election of Theodore. We've already covered this. It's important for Theodore, the questions remaining about the Lombardian schism, the rise of Islam, and his own Palestinian, Greco-Palestinian background. It's clear that Theodore was concerned about these issues, was totally on the side of the Maximian theological position, and at the same time was very effective in implementing certain aspects of Eastern piety and liturgical art. In fact, he introduced new Marian feasts into the Latin Rite, which were of Byzantine provenance. It's in the pontificate of Theodore, however, that we find a more uncompromising papal approach vis-a-vis the situation in Constantinople. John was more accommodating, even though he rejected the ekthesis. His language was measured. Theodore's language was very uncompromising and demands. And in 644, he leveled 3 complaints regarding Constans in action. The first is Constans's failure to annul the ekthesis, his failure to convene a council and condemn Pyrrhus, and the irregular status of Paul as Patriarch of Constantinople in relation to the deposition of Pyrrhus, and ultimately John deposes against imperial will Paul from the see of Constantinople. In some sense, we see John making unilateral demands, Theodore making unilateral demands along the model of later medieval popes, clearly asserting his primacy and independence vis-a-vis the universal church, and specifically the Church of Constantinople, with respect to the intra-ecclesial workings. By 645, Paul of Constantinople had had enough. He accuses Theodore of being uncivil, and he, in fact, reaffirms the ekthesis. In the same year, we find Maximus's famous disputation with Pyrrhus occurring in North Africa under the moderation of the exarch Gregory, the exarch who later revolts against Constans. And in 646, we have already mentioned this, Theodore deposed Paul through his nuncios in the capital, and commissioned Stephen of Dora in Palestine, we've already mentioned this, and sent word of to North Africa of a supposed dream of Maximus regarding the success of the exarch Gregory's revolt. Clearly, all three of these actions were directly opposed to imperial will, and implies a new self-understanding on the part of the Bishop of Rome vis-a-vis the empire and vis-a-vis Constantinople. And then in 648, 649, Theodore began preparing with Maximus and the Palestinian Greek monks, but especially Maximus, who in a sense is the ghostwriter of Lateran 649. Theodore began preparing for this synod to condemn monoenergism and monothelitism. And in 649, he dies and is unable to carry out his desires with respect to the council, but the council proceedings are directly taken up and executed by his successor, Pope Martin. And so, summing up, I've tried in this lecture to give a bit of the general background within the broader empire, as well as the more specific background that suggests motivations on the parts of the sees of Constantinople, Palestine, and Rome, and their various representatives, as well as the empire itself. On the parts of Rome and Palestine, the further disintegrating of the empire, coupled with what were taken, and rightly so, heretical views, were seen as evidence of God's wrath on the empire. Monoenergism and monothelitism were seen as contrary to the true meaning of Chalcedon and Leo, and there was a general stance of inactivity, of unwillingness to move on this, unwillingness to move away from the ekthesis and the typos on the part of the empire, or the emperor, and Paul of Constantinople. And these concerns developed into a widening rift and opposition between Rome on the one hand at this point in time, and Constantinople and the emperor on the other hand, and there developed a growing sense and assertion of papal primacy that had its seeds going back at least to Pope Gelasius. We find writings of Maximus in support of the primacy of Rome in the 640s. We'll look at some of these tomorrow in the next lecture, and other, ratifications of papal primacy from the same sector. And it was the strong belief of Maximus and Theodore and Martin that in order to avert divine wrath, and coupled with the growing self-recognition, or perhaps self-assertion, of papal primacy, especially with the well-being of the whole church, that a council was needed to clearly condemn both monoenergism and monothelitism, and this was executed in the Lateran Synod of 649, the Synod of St. Maximus and St. Martin. And we'll look at the aftermath and the acts of the councils in the next lectures.